The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everyone, it's Tammy Dungan here at Proposal Software. I wanted to welcome you all to this month's webinar, and I just wanted to check in to make sure that you can all hear me okay, that the audio is working. If you wouldn't mind just posting something into that question section of the GoToWebinar to confirm that you can hear me okay, that'd be great. Perfect. Thanks, Janelle. I have a few more minutes before we get started, so you can kind of settle in, and we'll hopefully get started in about 2 minutes. Thanks, Cynthia. Glad you can hear me okay. Hopefully everyone's screen is showing. We've got best practices for database structure today. Hopefully you can see that okay as well. As I mentioned, we'll get started in a few moments. We had quite a few people that registered for today's session. It's a pretty hot topic, database structure, so we'll make sure that we allow for enough people to join into the session before we get started. But we'll try to be as prompt as possible, as I know everybody's got busy schedules and lots to do. So I appreciate you all taking the time to join me today. Just another minute or two, as I see several people are coming on to the session. So I'll give it another minute or so before I officially get started here. Still waiting on several more people to join in, so I'll give it another minute. Usually it's a minute or so delayed before everyone actually gets logged into the session. So everyone's doing good and then starting to enjoy springtime weather. It's near 50s here, so looking like spring's hopefully around the corner soon, although I think we're going to get snow this weekend, so one never knows here in New England. I see a few more people coming into the session, so I'll give it just one more minute and then we will definitely get started. Get a number of people interested in database structure, so can't wait to share all these good practices with you. All right, we'll get started. I know it's about a minute or so after. I know everyone's extremely busy. Welcome. My name is Tammy Dungan. I'm the Professional Services Lead and Senior Consultant here at Proposal Software. I've probably spoken with many of you over the course of several years here. I'm going to be talking today about best practices for database structure. So we're going to go through some great tips and tricks today that will hopefully help all of you. Before we officially get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of standard housekeeping items that we have. First off is that we are on GoToWebinar, which is a little bit different than what we have for our typical GoToMeeting, which most of you have probably participated in with one of us at some point. The GoToWebinar sessions are muted for all of the attendees, but it's definitely not going to be a one-way street here, so you will have a chance to ask questions. You'll be able to pose those actually during the presentation, we'll allow for some time at the end. So I've got quite a bit of material I'm going to be covering, but then you'll be able to actually post your questions and jot them down into this kind of question section. If you can see my cursor moving on screen, hopefully. It's shown by this little diagram that we have from our GoToWebinar. I blew up for everybody and got an arrow pointing to our questions area. In that question section, when you click into that, you'll be able to pose those questions. They'll come to me directly, and I will be addressing those first come, first serve, as I mentioned, towards the end of today's session. If I don't, for some reason, get to them all, I'm hoping that there's going to be quite a few questions on our topic today. If I don't get to all of them, then I will certainly be able to, extract all of this at the end of the session. I'll get a nice readout, and then I'll be able to, kind of fill in those questions that I didn't get to address and can put that into our GoToWebinar after post-webinar. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention that we will be kind of popping up a brief survey of about 6 questions at the end of the session. Your feedback is extremely important to us. We appreciate whatever feedback you can give, whether that be good or bad. Hopefully it's all good. But we know that there are times when, we can always look for improvement, and if you don't tell us, then we can't possibly improve, and that's the goal. So please take a couple minutes once that session has been completed. It'll just, again, bring up just a couple questions. Fill that in for me. There's 1 or 2 new ones out there, actually, this go round. So, take some time, fill that out. Let us know if there's anything that you'd like for us to do differently, anything else that you would like to see in terms of features or sessions that you'd like for us to cover, and hopefully we can get that into the series this year. All right. So let's get started, and here's our agenda. I'm sure that at some point, most of you have felt like this at one time or another. Hopefully you're all laughing as you're sitting there thinking that, that's your day-to-day. The goal of today's session is really to help you dig out from the chaos and really get organized. So we're going to go over up front establishing some sustainable structure within the system, how you can go about doing that, the core concepts around the structure. Then I'm going to move into the demonstration directly in our PMAPS application. I'll come back, as I mentioned, I'll come back actually, and I'll provide a brief summary, of all of the materials that I pretty much covered, and then I'll open that up to questions for everyone. Okay? So establishing a sustainable structure. The first critical thing really is to get your subject matter experts buy-in into the process. When developing the content structure, you definitely want to contact your department heads that you typically deal with and ask for their internal contact that you would deal with for any RFP. You may already know these people, but you might be or may have just seen their name somewhere within an org chart, and they're so busy that they don't have time to respond to RFP requests, and they would actually defer to somebody else within the team. So it's always good to reach out to those department heads and find out, who is that critical person that you should be working with. And then you'd want to set up some meetings with them to explain what this process is that you're going to be establishing. You're going to want to discuss what that current role looks like, how that's going to evolve around the role that they're going to have, in this process. And you'd also want to look at establishing some regular face-to-face meetings with them, just because that really does go a long way. It gets you to really know that person. When you see them in the hallway, you actually can have some nice conversation, hopefully other than proposal requests that you might be sending to them. And then you also just want to check with them too on the process for the content reviews. Is there something that's changing on their side? Maybe they want to give you a heads up if there's going to be a policy change or something, so that you know that you need to reach out to them in advance. So it's really good to get their buy-in into any type of structure that you're creating, because they're critical, knowing that they're a department that you work with, and the assignment of that subject matter expert that will then flow into some of the review cycles and when things are actually due to be reviewed again. Then next, I always recommend that there should be some type of a content manager. It really is a full-time job, or a PMAPS committee. And the gatekeeper or content manager is someone that is critical, if possible, again, to the team, because they can maintain the content, they can add new information, they can archive things that are not being used. And that in itself is so important because it's going to alleviate any additional strain on the proposal writers. So that's going to really allow them to focus on writing and responding to bids versus trying to update information or send things out for review. So that's just such a time saver right there if you can have that person. And again, it is a full-time job, especially if you have a really large database. But I know that there isn't always a budget to hire somebody just for that because most folks think that that's really not a full-time job. But if that's not possible, then we do recommend that you maybe create a content committee. With that, then you can assign some responsibilities amongst the team to help really, conquer and divide basically, or divide and conquer rather, the database. So what that's going to do is really enhance the team itself. It's going to increase your kind of teamwork efforts. It's going to promote product knowledge. Hopefully, if you can assign different people that are comfortable or knowledgeable about a certain product that you have, it will just elevate them. And it will also build the relationships within the organization. Again, they'll be dealing with some of those subject matter experts, so they can have that nice back and forth relationship and communicate pretty freely, hopefully. Then next, I'd say you want to create from common requests. Whenever you're looking at creating a structure, it is recommended that you look at the activity of bids that you receive. You also want to look at, again, the departments and your subject matter experts. Who are you reaching out to for a lot of these requests? And you can kind of design by a department and then follow into a subject matter expert and even a product area, product or service. So when you think about completing a proposal, usually there is a table of contents that kind of gives you the structure of what the bid's going to look like. That's one way to look at it as well. You can also then use that for your main topics and subtopic categories. But generally, you receive a bid and it's going to be brought in and you're going to be responding it by a product. So it is always good to use a product designation. And in PMAPS, there are a couple fields that you can use as multi-select values, because sometimes you may have content that actually crosses over a couple of different products or services, and that's going to help reduce your content library in a good way, knowing that you're really kind of focusing in if one response can go across multiple, kind of maybe a platform, that's going to be a general response, and you won't have to have one for each one of those kind of sub-products maybe. And I know that does happen quite a bit. So you do want to look at the department, again, associated with your subject matter expert, and that's for sending information out, products and or services that are being offered, so that when you get to the product section of your proposal, you can then filter down based on the product area. It's really going to eliminate all of the other information that you have to weed through, because you're really focusing in on that product info. And then main topics, as we kind of drill down a little bit more, is going to be about 10 to 15 main topics. You do want to keep it at somewhat of a broad level in that main topic area. It should be able to kind of cross over some things, again, with your products and things like that. You could have just general firm information, right? And that can encompass your locations, your history, your background, various different kind of categories within there. And then subtopics. About 25 to 35 subtopics, and this really does depend truly on the size of your database. I'd say that's probably for a pretty decent mid-sized database, which could be, 2,500 or so records, or a little bit more than that. I have seen customers that are way beyond that. But with the subtopic categories, again, there should be some crossover. So you should be able to use some of those categories, hopefully, across many different main topics like policies and procedures, staff, for example. Those are things that are definitely going to fall within some of those other categories, or be used for many different subtopics or product or service areas. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of establishing and keeping a sustainable structure and where to start. And then I just want to talk about the core concepts for content. You definitely want to make sure that you review, refresh, and revise your data. This is something that should be done on a regular basis. What that means is that you should be checking in with your subject matter experts on a kind of frequency. That goes back to checking with your SME on their dedicated subject matter expert assigned to your records. That could be done annually, might be done more frequently than that. Also, those expiration dates and review cycles. Is this truly going to be the appropriate time for them to review this information? Some things they have no control over because it might be quarterly. There might be some content that they have that's just on an annual review. And if possible, you might want to look at kind of shifting it so it's not at year end because they're busy at that time. So find somewhat of a slow period. Still allowing them to go on vacation at that time as well, but be able to send them some information so it's a good process for everybody. Another thought on that too could be to spread out some of that information and just send it to them monthly. So if they have 200 records that are due every year at a single point in time, it might be best just to send them about 20 every month, and then everybody's in a nice cycle of sending and receiving information, and it's not too overwhelming. And then you also want to just obviously look at the content. Is it accurately written, and is it still valid to use? So that's going to be regular kind of compliance central reviews, most likely, sending some things out to them based on those review cycles and expiration dates. Additionally, I recommended that there should be a peer review that's done on your content to ensure what's in the system is actually valuable to those end users. Can they find that data? If not, you should probably ask them why. Based on your findings, then from there you can conduct those reviews, you can refresh some data, and you can revise as needed. You should also review the usage reports that are in PMAPS. Hopefully most of your users are using the insert functions within PMAPS, whether it's selected text or just that full-on insert. But if not, we do have that found button. So it's strongly recommended that they use that so that we can track that information, because as they're clicking through the application, it's automatically tracking. And that's one of the key things that can help any content manager or someone responsible for content, is that then they can, definitely review the information and see what's being used or not, and then they can archive from there. In part of the refresh process, I'd say that you'd also want to look at reducing redundancies in the content in your taxonomy. So you can refresh your pick lists where possible, refresh your contacts. That goes back to that frequent communication with your subject matter experts. And then your pick list values just might need to be consolidated depending on that feedback maybe that you got from your users if they're not finding information, because there's a couple of one-offs and they weren't sure what that category meant. So you can refresh the text as well within records for a consistent voice. You might also want to see, depending on the records that are there, is there a way that you can consolidate some of those? If you've done a search in a couple different ways, you can stack questions basically within a record and then just list this is the exact same answer. But that way when users are trying to find information, it's a little bit easier for them because they can search and see, here's this question asked, 5 different times, but yet I would always use the same answer. Once you've gone through that kind of refresh and review process, then you can make some necessary changes and revise the system, looking to make it a little bit more optimal for all the users. So you can remove some content as well and or restrict some access. So you can look at how the users are searching and inserting their content based on that times inserted, and maybe you want to, add some synonyms to the records or synonyms to the admin area rather. And if you're searching for firm, you also want to look for organization, company, things like that, and it'll give them a little bit more results. When you're looking at your usage reports, you'd be able to find that as well, because you'll see if they're searching for 5 different words, that's taking them 5 different, it could be 5 seconds, it could be 50 seconds, and that adds up after time. Okay. I'd also look at locking down changes. So once you've gone through this kind of setup of your system. You've got it all structured. You know that you're going to have to do this regular review process and update. You want to make sure that you lock down any changes just to maintain that structure and keep it in place. And there's a few things that we can do within PMAPS that can make sure that that stays in good standing. And I'll go over some of those when we get into the demonstration, but mainly it's, the admin only for editing pick list values. And there's also some kind of global where you can just say, I don't want it at a field level, but I actually want that to be entire lockdown for everybody. And I'll show you some of those when we get into the demonstration. And then also, just configuring and using attribute groups. I'm not sure if all of you have gone through, the implementation without having a database in place. That's something that we typically kind of consult with our customers and help them to establish, because they didn't have a structure in place. Some may have come over from, an existing system and they just needed to do a little bit of restructure as well. Either way, attribute groups are used in a few different areas within the application to add new data. There's lots of tips and tricks around creating attribute groups and how those can be kind of pulled together. The beauty of them is really that when you select them, it applies multiple attributes at one time. So it helps to save that admin some clicking and identifying where things should go. And if there are any structures that are put in place like that, and you've kind of established this, you've gone through, you've got attribute groups, that's really helpful if you're using those to add in new data. But also, I recommend that you kind of develop some aids to seek and find information that's going to help the end user significantly. And a couple of those things that I would create would be a roadmap, which basically will outline the structure that you've put in place. You may have your product and then some of the subtopics below that. You might have it by department, and you can fully see the hierarchy. And that will just help if there's turnover within the team and you get somebody new coming in, they can kind of look at that and see, if I want to find something, here's probably the category I would go to. So that's one. The other main point with that as well is if you are kind of sharing that committee approach of content, if you've got a nice roadmap, it will allow, so anybody that's singly adding content in, or individually, I should say, when they do that, they would also know, when I go to this main topic, I should follow suit with these subtopics that would typically fall underneath it. And that will ensure that, you don't have any kind of cross-contamination of things, and they pick something that really shouldn't go or be related to maybe a main topic, if that makes sense. And then some of the other aids that can be created would just be, doing a text search with synonyms. So when they're searching, again, build on that synonyms list. You can look at that report. You can go ahead and add some things to that list, and it'll yield them a little bit more results, because taxonomy is just, something that some folks think a little differently depending on the end user. And also maybe creating some save searches. Those can be really beneficial when you do have a lot of content. If you're responding to, a proposal and you've got various different subtopics that you need to kind of filter down on, and you feel as though you have to click many different things each time, saving some searches can just help with that, because it eliminates clicking on various different filters. So just as an example, I've kind of pulled together a main topic, subtopic kind of roadmap, just so that you can see what that would look like and give you a nice visual here. And it details the hierarchy I was talking about. So you may have a main topic, subtopic, and then you can see there's personnel, falls underneath team, org charts, turnover. But then I also have compliance and risk management. And I know that there's a team underneath this as well. You can actually have team pretty much underneath all of these, really, because you usually have staff associated with it, or a bio that you need to produce or something. And that team can just be kind of an overarching reference point. But this roadmap really is a great aid just for adding the new content, as I said, and it ensures that all the data is loaded properly and not misaligned with any existing structure that you've put in place. And then you can just update this if you should make any changes. But it's really going to eliminate that cross-contamination, picking the wrong values, or even just creating unruly pick lists because somebody thought something was in a category, but it was in a different location. So hopefully that's a good sample for you to take a look at. And then I'm just going to move into our demonstration PMAPS. So I'm going to show you how to configure system permissions and restrictions and talk a little bit about how you can lock down some fields. We'll talk a little bit about how you can also archive some data too, ways you can go about doing that, creating and managing your attribute groups. System usage reports, we'll take a quick look at that as well underneath the admin menu. And then I'll delve pretty deep into some of the best practice tips to edit and manage your pick list values, changing some values on that. And then also we'll do a little bit of global attribute changes, both on the search and the dashboard side. Okay. So let me bring up here my PMAPS database. So I'm in the dashboard of our event site here. Hopefully everyone can see this okay. I know it might be a little bit small. Some of the field values that you can change are basically at the field level, setting some of those restrictions so that they can't change maybe a certain client name field. Well, usually client name is actually pretty open, but it might be line of business or something along those lines that you really don't want them making any adjustments to the pick list values. So if you click on this little icon here, next to the right of any of the fields that have that icon, little piece of paper and pencil, you can then choose that only an administrator can edit the field, which means that they could edit here. Or you could say that only an administrator can edit the pick list values, which really means that here they cannot get into this value. They can't add another contact or another owner to this. It would be completely locked down. So those are a couple of ways that you want to be able to limit the changes that will happen within the database. And it maintains that structure that you've put in place, which is really critical, because we see that it gets out of control pretty fast. And that is at the individual field level. So you can see this one here is already marked as mandatory. If I were to select this particular one here, I am an admin, so it'd be kind of difficult. But when I come back in, any other user, they would just have a little kind of red X. They wouldn't be able to come in and make any changes to that specific field. Okay, that is typically an admin function, but it could be open depending if you're a small team. One way that you can globally set up the database so that it does not allow anyone really to make any changes, and you don't have to go field by field, because on the dashboard there's about 250 fields there. On the search, you've probably got about 25 or so that you can really change and make edits to. If you wanted to do a global setting, this attribute admin, if opted on here, kind of in this grade section, if that's enabled, basically, that means that only an administrator within the admin group could come in and make changes to the values or get to the fields. So that's more of a global setting I wanted to share with all of you. So that's in regards to setting up just that restriction field level and global into the system. And then the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was permissions and restrictions. So again, you've got your system set up, it's in great order, and you want to be able to lock down what some folks are going to be using. So I do want to restrict not just this at the field level, but I'd also maybe like to restrict some things in terms of viewing or even editing. We do have some groups that have allowed, like their compliance team or other departments to have access to PMAPS. It's been really beneficial for them. And in order for them to have some additional control, they've gone to that group and they've actually restricted that they can only edit their own data. So they can view other things. Compliance might want to see everything, but surely you don't want them to go in and just randomly, edit some things because they felt that they needed to. So you can do that at the group level. For review of some information where you may archive things, and I'll get a little bit deeper into that in just a few moments, But you might want to kind of look at some of those usage reports and see, are folks using the system for that insert capability? One, if they are, then on the search, you can look to see how many times they've actually inserted some content. If you have a bunch of content that hasn't been inserted, you can check with the team or enforce that they start using the found before you do this. But you can archive the data. So you can kind of set a field and just say it's going to be archived versus active. And then you can restrict that information. And I actually have a restriction set on here for all users. So when I click on this option here, I can then see that it's set at Q&A documents. It's going by the record status as that attribute on the search, and it's not equal to archived. So that means that they're going to see every record that is listed as active or doesn't have a categorization to it, or maybe it's pending. Right now, as long as it doesn't equal an archive status, it'll be visible to them. And you can set various different, levels of restrictions here. Come back down here again, maybe to the writer group. And I can do the same thing, for that whole editing piece of it. If I wanted to restrict something, you click on the plus, and I can then click on select the attribute here because it's editing. I can't edit the dashboard side, but maybe it's the subtopic. Equal to or not equal to, depending on which option or operator I'm going with, you can see that they are enabled. So this particular one in subtopic is really a pick list value. It's not a math or kind of number field or a text field. And depending on this option, it then kind of gives me my query results to say that there's 39 subtopics. Do I want to restrict? And then it gives me the list of those subtopics. So maybe I want to restrict viewing by, data validation or something. And when I pick that, it tells me that there isn't anything there truly. So that's kind of nice because it actually does tell me if there's any records and content associated with that. There's 11 records here, so I can restrict those, click save. And then I can see that that restriction has now been put on. So that's really good to do if you're going to open it up to other users. As I said, some customers are doing that and they found it really beneficial. Or if you need to just get rid of some of the information in your database that's not in use, or you have a product that you're not actively marketing, you don't want to completely remove the data because it's still good to use. At some point, you may need to bring that back because you begin marketing it again. It opens up in the fund or something. So you just want to archive it. You can do that. When you want to remove that, you can simply click on the number within the brackets, and then you can delete that. And it will remove that particular restriction, and then it would just be open for everybody once again. When I scroll back down, there's no restriction applied. So if you needed to, you could find some records, bring them back, mark it as active, and then just put that restriction back on if it was for, viewing archived files. Okay. So that's the permissions and restrictions along with archiving. We're going to do a global attribute change on the search in a few moments. Then we'll just show you how it kind of eliminates some of those when we switch them over to archive status. I'll walk through that. Before we leave the admin area, though, I do want to talk about the attribute groups. That's here underneath our Q&A search settings. And you can see that there are a few that are established here already. Attribute groups are set up and they're used for when we want to utilize our Smart Add or Add QA from our proposal editor, which is a nice function to quickly add some content in maybe while you're working from a proposal and build that into your process. With the attribute groups, it is good to have that attribute group name consist of a portion of what the attributes are. So in this case, if I click edit here, it brings up on my screen the kind of values that are associated with that attribute group name. So it's client service and it's company information and competitors. So you can see I just put an underscore in between each one of the words or kind of breaks of attributes. And that way it's easy for anyone to identify that it encompasses at least these 3 different attributes or categories. And when wanting to add new information, it'll be nice and quick for them to find, this is the appropriate one that I want to use. So admins can create this from here just by creating a group name, picking the attributes, and clicking save. This is, again, available just for adding new information. If you had historical Q&As added into PMAPS and you change something here, it won't affect any of the records that exist in the database today. It's really just going to be for that new content. So your add record, you can use it there. You can use it for the smart add, as I mentioned, in the proposal editor. And you can also use it for the upload documents feature. If you wanted to bring in policies and procedures or bios or something, every file would be brought in, and then you could apply the attributes at that time. Okay. And then lastly, while we're here, I'm just going to touch on our server reporting. As I mentioned, PMAPS is, kind of constantly tracking where the users are in the system. Big Brother, in a sense, is kind of watching, just wanting to know as users are clicking through the application. But it's helpful for the admin or the kind of system administrator, database administrator, content manager, whatever we want to label that these days, can look into here and just see what Q&A searches are being done. And this here shows if there's filters that are done. You can see I was kind of in there. I was looking for a couple numbers previously, but it gives a nice history of, how this information was being searched on. And if you find where they're looking for, a filter and they've filtered 3-4 different times, then you might want to approach that particular user. In this case, it's the admin 2, which is myself, and just ask, what was it exactly that you were trying to find? And then you can go through that process of maybe building out into the synonyms, or as I mentioned, kind of stacking some questions in there. Or maybe you need to get down to that restructure process and look at your pick list values. Oops. All right. So this server reporting is really helpful. As I mentioned, with your searches, you can also see the Q&A attributes. They're kind of, if anything's changed on those, if you need to. If you've made changes, you need to kind of look at that again, then you can do that. You can also export this information to Excel and look at it. You can also see where the information is being inserted. So you can tell if they are using that found button or they're just previewing records, if they've selected text or not. So if you're not seeing any activity here, you might want to, drop the hammer on those users and make sure that they're at least using that found button so that your times inserted totals will be increased. All right, so enough on the admin side of things. Let's take a look actually now at the search. So when we talk about the structure of our data, we've got various different categories, as I mentioned. Typically, you're going to have your department, a main topic, a subtopic. Your product will be important to that end user as they're in the product piece of that proposal. Summary information is good to see, and then a brief description of, what that information is, and that's a free text field that you can utilize for your own executive summary. Additionally, what I have in my view here, which will be important to any content manager, is going to be the record status, because I'm going to be changing that actually, or I want to have the capability to archive some things. So I have a field that I can then use to mark things as active or as archived, or maybe even use a pending attribute, because I need to kind of verify things before they go into the system. So this is important to show or use. And then the ID number, which is just the PMAPS ID number that's auto-generated. If you are going to be making any types of changes in PMAPS in terms of this structure here, It is recommended that you have the ID number showing, just because if I need to go back for some reason and make an adjustment, I like to just kind of make note of the numbers. And then that times inserted I was referring to, where it kind of tabulates each time that it's used. So when I go to insert, in this case, if I just want to mark this item as found, right, and I just refresh my screen here, that's 5428, and that top record, it got bumped up to 2 times inserted or used. So that number will just help the content manager understand what information is highly used. It also helps that end user, if they show this on screen and maybe they're caught between 2 answers here on company information and they're not quite sure which one to use, they could simply click on the one or use the one that has at least been used previously, because they know that maybe it's already been verified, it's a very popular answer, versus maybe this one-off that no one's even used. It was put in the system and not very important. So it's good to share these on screen, even for basic users, just to view them. To get a little bit more kind of in detail of what this information looks like, and if you think that you might need to do a little bit of changes to the structure of your system, we do have an export. You can export to Excel, XML, and to delimited text. This will only extract what we see in our search results screen. It's not going to extract the records. It's really just going to give me what shows as my structure or what's visible in my columns on screen. So here's that Excel file. I didn't have any filters on, so this is truly kind of the database itself. This here will then allow me to do a little bit of manipulation, maybe more so than I can in PMAPS, because although I can filter, you know, it's kind of maybe hard for me to see as I click something what all the other fields are that might be associated with some of the content. So here I can do a few things. I can select up here in this right-hand corner and do an insert of a pivot table. I love pivot tables. And then I can just look by maybe department, and I see that as my rows, and then just drag and drop that down here to my count of each of those. So when I'm thinking about making some changes, I can see client service really only has 2 records. Document links only has 3, and then internal only has 1. So maybe I need to look at archiving those. Maybe I need to just create a general category, or maybe I just created those, but I have more content to add to those categories. I can see that most of my information is for RFP responses, and I've got some that's, you know, proposal components. To me now, those are very similar, RFP responses and proposal components maybe, so you might consolidate those. So it's good that you can kind of see it laid out like this, and then you can also, I'm just going to copy these and paste them here, kind of duplicating this, and then I can change this to maybe the subtopic level and see the subtopic values. We've got quite a bit of these one-off categories. So within architecture, I can say I've really only got 1 record. So that tells me that it's probably hard for those end users to find information if they're not sure that the record was categorized as architecture. They might have thought of that question being asked as something else if they're using filters. Whenever setting up your structure, something else to mention really is that you should never have a 1-for-1 ratio, meaning you shouldn't have a single attribute of some kind, subtopic, product, main topic, just to 1 record. It's just too finite. You want to make sure that you've got a good group of, you know, records that are going to associate with that categorization. Because remember, in PMAPS, it's very much like a Google search. So they can always search for text within a record, and then those filters really help them to narrow down what's there. They can add more keywords to their search. They can use the synonyms and things like that. So it's always good to, you know, have it more of a broad category when you look at your structure. So if you need to, you know, make some changes here, this is outside of PMAPS. It's completely in Excel, and this just kind of gives you another view to see where you might want to do, again, some consolidation. You might look at security and passwords, and I see that there's only a couple of these. And now I want to be able to go back into PMAPS, and I want to consolidate some of those things. Because I've extracted it, I got my doc ID numbers. I've also got, my reference of it being active or not. And if you need to consolidate some things, then you can just filter based on the subtopic. Gives you a very similar list, right? And then I can just pick passwords, and I can pick security. And I can basically blend those two things by using the global attribute change. Or if it's really only two things, I could just filter on passwords. Here, I got those two. And now I just want to do a global change to subtopic, and I'm going to make that security. I'm not going to change anything else. All the other categorization I want to stay the same. I just wanted to be able to condense those. So when I click apply, I get my little prompt up here that indicates that it's going to change these for 2 records or files. And it can't be undone. So you definitely want to make sure that you proceed with this with caution, because there isn't an undo button here. So it just does show me here it was filtered. There's no records because it was passwords previously. So now if I reset my filters, I look at subtopic and I come down to security. I now see that there are 8 of those. So instantly move those over and brought them underneath that same subtopic category. And that's why it's good to have that in Excel, because if you needed to revert back to something and I need to find those couple of doc ID numbers, I could actually click here as well, and I could pick those 2 if it was these, and bring them back maybe to passwords if I didn't want those changed. So it's a nice backup to have. So that's how we can do a little bit of global change here. We can export and view the information that's there in Excel. Additionally, when you're looking at structure, you've got the pick list values. So not only do you have the content and what's applied there, you also have the categorization within the records themselves, or within the pick list of the system. So if I wanted to do something similar here, and I've condensed everything, and I know now that I've removed passwords, and that's just an extraneous, value in here, what you can do is come into here and you can edit these values. And I recommend doing this as well. You also have an export button here. Oh, I want to leave this quickly. It's going to open that. And it gives me all the subtopic values. So you can kind of match this up with that other extract that I took and just see, if I look at access, how many records were associated with that, then maybe I can just do a little bit of cleanup there. You just have to be very, methodical about doing that. As I mentioned, it's kind of a no undo button, so you got to proceed with caution, if you will. And, if it's all gone, then you've kind of removed passwords in this case, I can then find passwords and I can just delete this or remove this from my pick list values. That way no one will pick it again. However, if I did have that associated with some content possibly, and I removed that value, maybe I archived some data, this happens at times, and that value is still applied, what you would do, there could potentially be a resync of the values, and that is actually in this edit values one more time. There's a sync button. If this button is clicked, then it will actually bring back all values that it sees in the main topic, even though I may have removed it from this list here. So if content is associated and you didn't remove it from this pick list and then you sync that button or somebody clicks it, it will refresh the list. So just keep that in mind, and then you may need to do cleanup, all over again. So you definitely want to do it in a couple different stages to make sure that you're not going to have to do some rework once again. Okay. So that's how you can pull out some data from the system, kind of do a little bit of cleanup, right, in terms of what you've got for information that's currently in there, and just kind of go through within the system making some changes that are there. All right. So we've gone through some of those things here. Just going to click back to my results area. And I also just wanted to kind of go over that archive process. I'm going to reset my filters here. And I see that most of this information here, right, I'm looking at my times inserted again. To archive some things, I've already set up that restriction underneath my administration area. So I know that anything that might be marked that way would just be automatically removed from its visibility in the search. I do want to see anything that's, 0 times inserted. Again, you want to make sure that you're checking with your end users that they're using that found button. So be sure that you check that usage report before you do this. And also, you might want to give them some time if they weren't using it to start using it so that you don't archive something that you don't mean to. So in this case, I see there's 77 records they're marked as active, but yet they haven't been used, right? A lot of these look to be just duplication. So I can just quickly mark them as archived by using my global attribute change here. And it's going to be the record status as archived. I'm not going to change anything else. Just going to click apply. Tells me it's going to go through all 77 records of these. And it's going to take just a couple seconds for this to run through all of those and update each record status to archived. It's moving pretty quickly. Still chugging along. We're almost there. Just about there. Perfect. So it tells me that there's now no records because I was filtered on no times used, 0. So now there's nothing left with that particular designation. So if I reset, I can see that now my total number has actually dropped from 200 something down to just 148. And I'm seeing active records here. These were record status that were just blank before. But when I look at the times used, I'm not seeing 0 there anymore. So it's kind of eliminated, and that will help your end users to be able to find their content a little bit faster as well, because they're not going to be weeding through some of that extra material. Okay. All right, so now that we've gone through quite a bit of information about changes to PMAPS, exporting data, I'm just closing out some of these things here. We're just going to come back to our presentation, and I'll summarize for you. So truly what we want to do is make sure that we design with a common taxonomy using recent RFPs, keeping that format of using your attributes to have them manageable and at a minimum, again, using department, subject matter expert references, product references as well, and then main topic, subtopic. Main topics about 10 to 15 usually, and then somewhere around 25 to 35 depending on your database size for your subtopics. You also want to utilize attribute groups to keep your structure stable and ensure that that core attributes kind of structure in place remains. Collectively collaborate with everybody. That means your subject matter experts. That means your key stakeholders, anyone in the process, and also members on the team to make sure that it's truly going to be beneficial for them in finding information. The structure is going to make sense. And then configure with the end in mind. So once the structure is established, you want to limit access to admins or content managers so that you can make sure that that structure really does stay in place and it doesn't kind of get out of control by allowing others to make access or changes to the system. And you should always review, refresh, and revise your information. So you want to go through regular reviews, minimum annually, to see if more information is needed or can be consolidated. Refresh when needed with your subject matter experts to update all the content at least annually as well, and archive if it's not being used. Revise information by, you can archive that content or delete it if needed, or not needed, I should say. Look at stacking questions into records for optimal retrieval as well. Build synonyms based on what you're seeing in your search usage reports, and you can remove redundancies in your pick lists. And then lastly, really is to, methodically manipulate the information. If you are going to have to restructure some things, make sure you export the full structure get times inserted, your doc ID numbers in your view, and your descriptions as well will be very helpful to you. Review those outside of PMAPS probably, like I did, and then just go in and make some of those changes with a global attribute change to revise the information. So, all right, so let's open it up to questions. I see that we do have a few. For the folks from the other departments divisions, Elaine's asking, who have read-only access, are they also being tracked as far as pulling stats on insert or found records? That's a good question, Elaine. They are not being tracked if they are just preview-only users. Truly, when they're in there, they're just really, previewing a file. When they have to open it up, it shows that they previewed it, I should say, but you don't really know actually if they had used it. And I don't believe preview-only users have the found button either. Stephen, when do you do a global replace? When you do a global replace, does PMAPS track that in the revisions tab? Good point, Stephen. Yes, it does. So any changes that are made within the system, it is also tracked in revisions. And you can then kind of refer back to that. If you did need to revert back to, something with the content, you could do that. The revisions will also show if you did make a change to a record and you kind of changed one attribute to another. And that will give you some good information for reference as well in that revisions area. So good point, Stephen. Scott had a question. Is it possible to exclude archived records from search results for all users? Yes, Scott. That's basically what I had gone through. Was I created a restriction and I applied it at the all user level. So even myself as the administrator, as you saw, did not see those archived records once I changed them to that status. So it kind of blocks it from my view as well. And then if I need to go back in, I still have the power to unlock that. It would be visible to everybody. Or you could set it up where you as the admin still could see those in case you needed to make some adjustments. Anna had a question, can you bring back records that have been archived? Absolutely. So if you wanted to bring back a record that had previously been archived, for that purpose, what you'd want to do is really just go back into the admin area, take off that archive status, and then look for the record. You do a search to find the record, and then you just change the status of that record to active at that point. And you can go back in and you can set your restriction back on, and it makes it back in the general population. Noel question, is there a way to search content within completed documents uploaded to the dashboard? There isn't a way to search the content that is in the documents of the dashboard. That's a little bit different. The documents of the dashboard are really the entire RFP as a single kind of file. So for that, what you would do is just basically open up the document, right? And then, you can do a control find to search within Word, really. But unfortunately, there isn't a way necessarily to search unless, when you open, if you are doing an insert actually into the proposal, and I'm not sure if there are any in our sample database, but as you insert into a document, if you do a full-on insert, it will show the bookmarks that you've inserted there. You can kind of see that on your side panel. I'm not sure. Here, I brought this on screen here in my dashboard just to show you. Let's see if there's one here. It would kind of indicate if you had inserted. So you just look at your bookmarks. And we want to show options and show bookmarks. Yep. So in this case, I can see, this one answer was actually inserted. That's how I can search to find. And again, it's basically by doc ID number. So hopefully that makes sense to you. Hopefully that answers your question, Noel. And Elaine, another question, is it feasible to include the content of Notes tab in the search results? The Notes tab should definitely be able to be included. So let me come back and close this here. And when we look at our search, and I want to modify my columns. These are kind of alphabetical by tab though. I want to see the notes of the notes tab, and then I can just bring this up and then bring that into my view. So you'll see that's here. So yep, you can absolutely do that. It's a good question, especially if you are using definitely the notes. And then clarification actually on the preview users, it will show if someone has downloaded or preview of the file, but it won't mark it as found. And there is no found button, sorry. So, excellent, great questions. I'm very excited that I had some great questions today. Hopefully I answered all of those for you. Please take a couple of minutes to answer our survey. Make sure, that you've kind of, taken a couple minutes to go ahead, fill out any feedback that you have on any future sessions that you'd like to see, features that you'd like for us to cover, suggestions, and go ahead and do that. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to your customer success manager, or you can, just send us a quick email, and we can try to address those for you. Hopefully you enjoyed today's session, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.